The millionaire thought she was infertile and abandoned her 16 years ago. But one day he fell to his knees when he saw her with a child. The rain fell heavily that evening, a relentless downpour that blurred the bright city lights of Manhattan. Lucas Bradford, a man of unimaginable wealth, stood at the edge of his sprawling mansion's stone steps, his gaze cold and distant as he looked out at the world he had created. Inside, nestled in the shadowed warmth of the grand foyer, Eliza watched him through tear-streaked eyes, barely daring to hope he might turn around and reconsider. But he didn't. 16 years had passed since that moment, and Lucas had buried himself in the empire he built, casting aside the love he'd shared with Eliza in favor of a dream that seemed just out of reach: a family. That night had been the breaking point. When he had finally walked out, he was convinced that leaving her was a necessary sacrifice. She, in his eyes, had failed him in the one way he could not forgive. She could not give him the family he'd always envisioned. He had loved Eliza fiercely, with a passion that came so naturally it was almost frightening. But the dream of a child, of a legacy that stretched beyond his wealth, ate at him with a quiet fury. He could not look at her without seeing what they could not have, and the bitterness he harbored grew like a poison. It was easier to let her go than to drown in what they could never achieve together. The car idled at the end of the driveway, its headlights casting sharp beams through the mist. With a final glance at the mansion he'd shared with Eliza, he turned his back on her, resolute in his choice. She called his name, her voice a fragile whisper that barely reached him over the pounding rain, but he didn't pause. With each step away from her, he forced himself to sever the last threads that tied them together. He told himself he was doing the right thing, that he was protecting himself from a future of quiet disappointments. The mansion's lights faded behind him as he left, but Eliza's silhouette stayed imprinted in his mind long after the car sped down the winding road. He forced his eyes forward, his heart a cold weight in his chest. For Lucas, it was a door he'd closed permanently, locking away his love for her alongside the unreachable dream of a child. And somewhere behind him, Eliza fell to her knees, alone in the dark, her fingers grazing the cold floor where he'd stood only moments before. 16 years later, Lucas Bradford found himself in a grand hall brimming with laughter, music, and the clinking of glasses. It was a fundraiser, one he'd been invited to by a prominent business partner. The world hadn't changed much for Lucas over the years. His wealth had only grown, and his social circle swirled around him as ever: captains of industry, philanthropists, socialites. Yet, despite the crowd, he moved through the event with an almost detached air, his gaze skimming past unfamiliar faces. And then he saw her, Eliza. The room seemed to fade away, the colors and sounds dimming as his gaze fixed on her. There across the hall she stood. Her elegance was even more profound than he remembered. She moved with a quiet confidence that had only deepened over time. He felt a jolt, something he hadn't felt in years, something he couldn't name but was immediately undeniable. Time froze, and he felt his breath catch, stunned by the sight of her so close yet impossibly out of reach. But it wasn't just her presence that left him riveted. Beside her stood a young boy, perhaps 15 or 16, with dark eyes that scanned the room with a curiosity and attentiveness that felt hauntingly familiar. The boy had Eliza's features, but something in the way he held himself struck Lucas with an inexplicable sense of recognition. His chest tightened and his thoughts scattered, his logical mind unable to reconcile the image before him. The child laughed, leaning close to Eliza as they shared a private joke, her smile softer and brighter than any he remembered seeing. He stood frozen, unable to process the flood of emotions tearing through him. How could it be? For a brief, agonizing moment, he wondered if he was dreaming. But no, this was real. Too real. A rush of memories came crashing back, of their quiet nights, of whispered dreams, and of her face distraught the last time he had seen her. Lucas's world tilted. He couldn't tear his gaze from the boy, from the almost surreal connection he felt to him, a feeling he couldn't shake, no matter how he tried to dismiss it. The room felt stifling, the weight of 16 years pressing down on him in an instant. He barely noticed as the conversation around him dwindled, his heart pounding with questions and a strange, dawning terror. Every assumption he'd built his life upon seemed to unravel in the space of a single glance. And Lucas, a man who had never known defeat, felt his knees go weak. Years ago, before their love was overshadowed by disappointment, Lucas and Eliza were inseparable. They met at a charity gala, not unlike the one he found himself at tonight. Lucas had been captivated by her sharp intellect and her unwavering kindness, qualities rare in the circles they moved in. She saw in him a depth of ambition and vulnerability that few could see beyond his polished exterior. Together they dreamed of a future filled with warmth, laughter, and above all, the joy of a family to share it with. Their love blossomed quickly, yet remained grounded, strong, and almost sacred. They found comfort in each other, in the shared silences that felt as profound as the words they spoke. But as the years passed, the absence of children cast an unexpected shadow over their joy. They began planning for a family almost as soon as they were engaged. At first, it was just a hopeful conversation here and there, but soon months turned into years, and their hope became tinged with worry. Eliza was the first to voice her concern. One evening, over a quiet dinner, she gently suggested they see a doctor. Her tone was soft, reassuring, reminding him that it wasn't a sign of weakness but a step they could take together. She reached for his hand, trying to soothe the tension that had begun to weigh on them. But Lucas brushed it off, his pride stinging. To him, acknowledging the need for medical help felt like an admission of failure. "There's nothing wrong with me," he'd said, his voice taut, the words sharper than he intended. He assured her that they just needed more time, that it would happen naturally as it should. Eliza, hurt but understanding, let the conversation go, retreating into a silence that would eventually grow between them like a chasm. Over time, though she tried to bring it up again, Lucas's reaction was always the same, a mixture of frustration and denial. His dreams of fatherhood were as intense as ever, but he refused to consider that anything could stand in the way. Meanwhile, Eliza watched as her own hopes began to fade, her once constant smile dimming as the years passed. In her heart, she couldn't shake the feeling that this might be their fate, that perhaps the family they dreamed of would remain just that, a dream. Their love endured, but the struggle etched lines of pain across Eliza's face, each one a testament to the quiet sorrow she carried. And Lucas, blind in his pride, could not see the toll his denial was taking on the woman he loved. The night Lucas made his decision to leave was etched into Eliza's memory like a scar that would never fade. It was late, and they had spent another evening circling the same conversation, each word tearing deeper into the wounds that had festered over the years. The unspoken bitterness of lost dreams lay heavy in the air, and each silence between them felt like a wall rising higher, blocking out any hope of reconciliation. Lucas had been withdrawn for weeks, his demeanor colder, more distant, as though he was already drifting away from her in his mind. The night he left, they sat in their dimly lit living room, the weight of their silence pressing down like a physical force. She had tried once more to reach him, to suggest counseling, a specialist, anything that might give them a chance to bridge the gap between them. She had spoken softly, her words filled with desperation and a plea she could no longer hide. But Lucas's face had hardened, his expression unreadable. For a man so used to control, so unwilling to face the possibility of failure, the very thought of a future without his vision of a family felt like a betrayal he could not bear. He steeled himself, his jaw clenched as he avoided her gaze, speaking the words that would shatter her heart. "I can't keep doing this, Eliza," he said finally. His voice clipped, almost robotic. "I need a future. I need a family. And if you can't give that to me, then we have to face reality." Her eyes widened, stunned by the finality in his tone. "Lucas, please don't do this. We can find a way. Love you. Isn't that enough?" But to Lucas, love wasn't enough, not without the promise of the legacy he so desperately desired. He swallowed, pushing away the guilt that clawed at him as he forced himself to look into her tear-filled eyes. "I'm sorry, Eliza. I can't wait forever," he said, his voice breaking slightly as he turned his back, his heart heavy but his mind resolute. She called after him, her voice a strangled whisper, begging him to reconsider, to give them another chance. But he kept walking, his footsteps echoing down the empty hallway, each step pulling him further away from her and the life they had built together. The door closed behind him, the final resounding note of the love they'd shared. And as Lucas disappeared into the night, Eliza crumpled to the floor, her sobs echoing through the empty rooms that now felt more like a tomb than the home they had once dreamed of filling with laughter. Lucas sat in his car outside the gala, his mind whirling with the sight he had just witnessed. Eliza with a child. The boy had seemed so comfortable at her side, a natural part of her life, her world. The thought gnawed at him, refusing to be dismissed, despite his every effort to rationalize it. Could he really be his?
Well,
Lucas shook his head, clinging to reason as though it were a lifeline. It wasn't possible. She couldn't have children. He'd convinced himself of that long ago, used it to justify walking away from the only woman he'd ever truly loved. Now, the sight of her with that boy unsettled him in ways he couldn't explain. As the engine idled, he leaned back, trying to bring himself to a place of logic. He reasoned that she must have adopted, maybe even shortly after their breakup. It was a simple explanation, and one that any rational person would accept. But something didn't sit right. His pride whispered that he was right to leave her all those years ago. After all, he'd given her a chance to make their family dream come true. He'd been the one willing to walk away, painfully but firmly, in the belief that he could find the family he wanted without the constraints he felt she had brought. And yet the doubt lingered. The boy was about 16, around the age it would have been possible if he was, indeed, Lucas's son. The idea twisted his heart in a way he could hardly describe, an ache that felt as unfamiliar as it was excruciating. He scolded himself for even entertaining such thoughts. But something about the boy's resemblance, the feeling of kinship that struck him at first sight, refused to dissipate. "Get a grip, Lucas," he muttered, gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. Pride, the same pride that had once shielded him from what he thought were Eliza's failures, now bristled at the notion that he might have been wrong. He hadn't come this far in life by allowing uncertainty to rule him. He was a man who made decisions and stood by them, no matter the cost. And yet there was something about this, something he couldn't let go of. Despite every attempt to convince himself that the boy was someone else's, the notion scratched at him, planting seeds of doubt that he could not uproot. For the first time in 16 years, Lucas found himself questioning everything. As the days passed, Lucas found himself haunted by the image of Eliza with that boy. At first, he dismissed it as a momentary weakness, a flash of nostalgia for the life he'd chosen to leave behind. Yet, no matter how much he tried to convince himself it was nothing, his thoughts kept circling back to that moment in the gala, to the boy's face, a face that looked achingly familiar in ways he couldn't deny. Curiosity soon transformed into an obsession. He caught himself imagining every detail he could recall, the boy's gestures, his mannerisms, the way he laughed, and the easy comfort he shared with Eliza. The more he thought about it, the less sense his own reasoning made. Could it really be that simple? Had she truly moved on, adopted a child, and built a life without him? Or, could there be a far more devastating truth? The idea gnawed at him, and for the first time, Lucas found himself feeling something he had rarely encountered in his life: regret. He had walked away from her, sure that he had made the right choice, secure in the belief that her inability to bear children meant they were incompatible. But now, seeing her again with the boy, he felt the first cracks in his armor of certainty. Driven by an inexplicable need for answers, he began to watch her life from afar, finding himself wrapped in the mystery that surrounded her new family. He found ways to ask around discreetly, seeking any information he could without tipping his hand. Each time he learned more, his heart raced with equal parts fear and anticipation. What if the boy was his son? Late one evening, Lucas sat alone in his penthouse, the city lights glittering through the windows. He swirled his glass of whiskey absently, lost in thought. Memories of his time with Eliza rushed back, sharper and more vivid than they'd been in years. He remembered her laughter, her kindness, and the endless patience she'd shown him, even when he was at his most stubborn. He'd walked away from that, telling himself he deserved more, yet now he was beginning to wonder if he'd misjudged everything. The idea unsettled him deeply, stirring emotions he'd long buried. Lucas knew he had to find out the truth, not just for his own peace of mind but for the sake of the boy. If that child was his, he owed it to him to know, to make up for lost time. He had no idea how far he was willing to go to get those answers, but he knew one thing for certain. He could no longer ignore the questions that had taken root in his heart. Lucas's curiosity grew into a relentless drive, a need that shadowed his every waking moment. He found himself trapped in an endless loop of memories, reliving each significant moment he had shared with Eliza, dissecting the way things had fallen apart, searching for clues he might have overlooked. What if he had been wrong all along? What if, in his haste to protect his dreams, he had pushed away the one person who truly loved him? As the days turned into weeks, Lucas's distraction became impossible to hide, and the people closest to him began to notice, especially his wife, Clara. Their relationship had never been rooted in the same kind of love he once shared with Eliza, but rather in a comfortable compatibility. Clara was well suited to his lifestyle, charming, well-connected, and adept at handling the social duties that came with being Lucas Bradford's wife. Yet lately, even Clara's presence felt like an intrusion. Every time she spoke, every question she asked felt like noise, an unwelcome reminder of the life he'd chosen to build after leaving Eliza behind. He would catch himself drifting during their conversations, his mind wandering back to the boy, back to Eliza, back to the haunting thought that he might have a son out there whom he had abandoned without ever knowing. At first, Clara brushed off his aloofness, assuming it was just stress from work. But as days passed, Lucas's silence grew, and he spent more time away from home, often in the corners of cafes or near Eliza's neighborhood, hoping for a glimpse, hoping to see more. Clara tried to draw him back to her, arranging dinners and trips, but he was there in body alone, his mind lost in a different world. Lucas's behavior was so unlike the man she knew. Controlled, focused, determined. Now he was distracted and even visibly emotional, something that shocked her. She began to suspect that something deeper was going on, though she couldn't yet imagine the extent of it. Lucas would come home late, lost in thought, and retreat to his study without so much as a word. And though Clara asked, he never shared, preferring to deflect and avoid her questions. But Lucas could barely look Clara in the eye. Every time he tried, all he saw was the truth he was beginning to realize about himself. A man who had let pride and fear rule his life, only to find himself yearning for a past he had long abandoned. He couldn't pretend any longer that nothing was wrong. The urge to know the truth, to confront Eliza, was consuming him whole, and his marriage, along with his carefully constructed life, began to fray at the edges. Clara's patience wore thin as Lucas's distance grew more pronounced. Their dinners turned into quiet affairs, filled with empty exchanges and half-hearted attempts at conversation. She knew something was amiss, yet each time she asked, Lucas sidestepped her questions, leaving her feeling more isolated and ignored. Clara was not the kind of woman accustomed to being left in the dark, especially not by her own husband. One evening, unable to contain her frustration any longer, Clara confronted him. She had waited until they were alone in the living room, the sounds of the city humming softly outside. Her tone was sharp but not unkind, masking the genuine concern she still held for the man she'd married. "Lucas, what's going on with you?" she demanded, her arms crossed tightly across her chest. "You've been distracted, distant. It's like you're not even here." He looked up, startled, as if she had pulled him out of a dream. "It's nothing, Clara. Just work stress," he muttered, but even to his own ears, the excuse sounded hollow. Her gaze hardened. "Don't insult me, Lucas. This isn't about work. You've been somewhere else for weeks now. You don't even look at me the same way anymore." Her voice softened, laced with the hint of a plea. If something is wrong, I need to know. I'm your wife. You can talk to me. But Lucas found himself unable to meet her eyes. How could he possibly explain the turmoil that had taken hold of him, the questions he didn't yet have answers to, the doubt and guilt that gnawed at him every time he thought of Eliza and that boy? Clara had been a partner, yes, but he couldn't share this with her. This wasn't her story. It was his and Eliza's, a story he'd long thought was over but now felt painfully unfinished. Clara's expression shifted from frustration to something colder, more calculating. You know, if this is about another woman, just say it, she said quietly, her voice laced with an edge of bitterness. I can handle the truth, Lucas. But I won't be left here wondering while you play some twisted game. Lucas stiffened, taken aback by her words. It's not another woman, he replied defensively, though he knew his answer was only partly true. I just need some time to figure things out. Clara's lips tightened. Fine, she said, her voice flat and controlled. But don't expect me to wait forever while you chase ghosts. She turned on her heel and left the room, leaving Lucas alone with the weight of his own making. The silence that settled around him was heavier than any argument, and Lucas felt the walls of his life closing in. He was running out of excuses and out of time. The pressure from Clara, combined with the relentless questions gnawing at him, finally drove Lucas to take a step he had been dreading and craving in equal measure. After days of internal debate, he decided to reach out to Eliza. The decision felt monumental, like crossing a threshold he could never come back from. Sitting in his dimly lit study, he drafted a message, his fingers trembling as he typed and retyped the words. Hi Eliza. Hope you're well. I know it's been a long time, but I was wondering if we might meet. There's something I need to talk to you about. Please let me know if you'd be open to meeting. After sending the message, he waited, each minute stretching into an eternity as he anxiously checked his phone. Doubts churned within him. Would she even respond? Had she completely moved on, buried his memory as thoroughly as he'd tried to bury hers? The prospect of facing her again felt as daunting as it did necessary, for he couldn't shake the possibility that this child might somehow be his, that he had unknowingly abandoned his own flesh and blood. It took an entire day before he received a reply, a short message that was painfully formal yet agreed to meet. They arranged to meet at a small, quiet cafe downtown, far from the glitzy places where Lucas usually conducted business. He arrived early, nervous in a way he hadn't felt since he was a young man. As he waited, he rehearsed his words in his mind, struggling to find a way to broach the topic without sounding intrusive or desperate. Finally, Eliza entered, and for a moment Lucas's breath caught. She had aged gracefully, with the same elegance that had captivated him years ago, but there was a calm confidence about her now, a strength that had only deepened over time. She spotted him, and her face registered a mixture of surprise and guarded emotion as she walked over. They exchanged a polite greeting, sitting down across from each other as if they were two strangers instead of people who had once shared a life. The air between them was tense, thick with memories and unspoken questions. After a few awkward moments of small talk, Lucas finally worked up the courage to say the words he'd been holding back. Eliza, I saw you the other night, at the gala, with your son. He hesitated, watching her face carefully, trying to read her expression. I need to know, is he? Eliza's expression softened, but there was a firmness in her gaze, as if she'd anticipated this question. Eliza took a steadying breath, her eyes meeting Lucas's with a mix of compassion and resolve. For a moment, the world around them seemed to disappear, leaving only the years of pain and questions hanging between them. Lucas held his breath, unable to look away, his heart pounding with equal parts dread and hope. Lucas, she began, her voice calm but filled with an unmistakable gravity. I know what you're going to ask, and you deserve an honest answer. His heart raced, clinging to her every word, his mind flashing through a dozen different outcomes. But nothing could have prepared him for what she would reveal. After you left, I went to a doctor, she said quietly, her voice steady but tinged with the memory of old wounds. I wanted answers too. I needed to know for my own peace of mind. And it turned out, There was nothing wrong with me. She paused, watching him absorb her words, the truth slicing through him with chilling clarity. He stared at her, stunned. For years, he had believed that she was the one who couldn't give him the family he'd dreamed of. The thought that he might have been the problem, that his pride and impatience had led him to abandon her unjustly, settled on him like a crushing weight. Eliza continued, her gaze unflinching. I found someone after you left. A man who accepted me as I was, who didn't see me as incomplete. We built a life together, and yes, that boy you saw. He's my son, but he's not yours. Her words were gentle but final, allowing no room for misinterpretation. Lucas felt a wave of devastation unlike anything he'd ever experienced. He had spent years telling himself that leaving her was the only choice, that she had been the one who couldn't fulfill his dreams. But now, faced with the truth, he realized how deeply he'd wronged her. He had lost not just her love, but the life they might have shared, a life that now belonged to someone else. You found someone else, he echoed. His voice barely more than a whisper, disbelief etched into every line of his face. Yes, she replied simply, her expression a mixture of sadness and forgiveness. And I'm happy, Lucas. I've found peace, and I have the family I always dreamed of, even if it looks a little different than I imagined. The realization hit him with the force of a wave. He was too late. His choices, his pride, and his assumptions had led him down a path that now lay in ruins. Lucas lowered his gaze, a single tear slipping down his cheek, unable to look at the life he'd left behind, the life he had sacrificed for a dream that had never truly been out of reach. Days after his painful conversation with Eliza, Lucas couldn't escape the gnawing sense that everything he had believed about himself and his life was slipping through his fingers. In a desperate attempt to understand, to find some closure or clarity, he booked an appointment with a doctor. A small part of him held on to the hope that Eliza's test results had been a fluke, that perhaps there had been something she missed, something he could understand better now. Sitting in the sterile, impersonal environment of the doctor's office, he felt vulnerable in a way he hadn't in years. He waited, his thoughts tangled, trying to prepare himself for any outcome. When the doctor finally entered with his results, Lucas was nearly trembling. The doctor's tone was gentle but precise, each word landing like a blow. Mr. Bradford, based on these tests, I can confirm that you've always been sterile. The words hung in the air, each syllable pulling him deeper into a chasm of disbelief and devastation. It's unlikely that you would have ever been able to father children, the doctor added softly, sensing the weight of the news. Lucas felt the floor shift beneath him. His mind rebelled against the reality, struggling to accept that the very thing he had once held against Eliza, the reason he had walked away from the woman he loved, was never hers to bear. All those years he'd carried resentment, believing she had failed him, never once considering that it might have been his own body denying him the legacy he sought. The truth crashed over him like a wave, relentless and unyielding. He was the one who had been unable to create the family he had dreamed of, the family he had abandoned Eliza to pursue. His pride had led him to assume that she was the source of their heartache, that he was justified in walking away because he deserved more. The irony was merciless, cruel in its precision. He sat in stunned silence, his gaze fixed on the floor. The weight of his actions, the knowledge of what he had done, pressed down on him, suffocating him. The family he had longed for, the love he had sacrificed. He had destroyed it all because he had been unwilling to confront his own vulnerabilities. For the first time in his life, Lucas Bradford, the powerful, self-made man, felt utterly powerless. And as he left the doctor's office, the realization settled heavily within him. He had only himself to blame. The medical revelation unraveled Lucas's life in ways he hadn't anticipated. Shaken and devastated, he returned home, his mind a storm of thoughts he could neither silence nor control. If he had always been sterile, then what did that mean for his life now? What did it mean for his family, for his son, Austin? The question plagued him, growing louder with each passing day until he could no longer ignore it. The uneasy tension between him and Clara had only intensified since he'd met with Eliza. Clara sensed his withdrawal, but now he also saw her through a new lens, the seeds of doubt taking root and deepening the divide between them. One evening, unable to bear the uncertainty any longer, he approached her with the question that had come to haunt him. Sitting across from her in their quiet living room, he took a deep, steadying breath. "Clara, there's something I need to ask you." His voice was low, his words carrying the weight of a man stripped of certainty. Clara looked up, startled by the intensity in his tone. "What is it, Lucas?" she asked, wary. He hesitated, searching for the right words, though he knew there was no gentle way to ask. "Austin, is he mine?" The question came out as barely a whisper, yet it shattered the fragile calm between them. For a moment Clara's face remained unreadable, but then he saw it, the flicker of fear, the shift in her gaze as she averted her eyes. She took a long, shaky breath before she spoke. "Lucas, I never thought this would come up," she began, her voice strained, each word heavy with the truth she could no longer conceal. "Austin, he isn't biologically yours." The room fell silent as the words settled, and Lucas felt his world splinter further. Every illusion he'd held about his family, his legacy, his place in this life, everything he'd believed was his, now lay in pieces. He had spent years believing Austin was his son, had poured his dreams and hopes into him, never suspecting that the foundation of his life was built on a lie. Clara's voice broke the silence, softer now, almost pleading. "It was a mistake, Lucas. It was before we were married. I thought I could keep it hidden, that it wouldn't matter if we raised him together. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to hurt you." But her words felt hollow, empty. Lucas could only stare, feeling a numbness settle over him as the weight of her betrayal pressed down on him. The family he had sacrificed everything for, the legacy he had abandoned Eliza to chase, it had all been an illusion. And for the second time in his life, Lucas felt utterly alone, realizing that his search for a family had cost him everything. In the days following Clara's confession, Lucas found himself adrift, his world an empty shell echoing with his own regrets. The walls of his once grand mansion felt cold and foreign, no longer the fortress of success and stability he'd believed it to be. Every corner of his life seemed to bear the haunting reminders of choices made, of moments lost to pride and a refusal to face his own flaws. He spent long hours alone, replaying every decision that had led him here. His insistence on leaving Eliza, the love he had so easily abandoned in his quest for a family, felt like a mistake that cut deeper with every passing day. He had loved her once with a purity he didn't think possible, but he had allowed his own fears and assumptions to build barriers between them, ignoring her pleas for understanding and patience. He had thought his dreams of fatherhood were worth more than the love they shared, only to find that his family had always been within reach, if only he'd been willing to face the truth. Eliza's revelation, the knowledge that she was not the one who had been broken, was a truth that gnawed at him constantly. Lucas had always seen himself as powerful, in control, a man who shaped his own destiny. But this journey had shown him the ways in which he had been blind, weak, and above all deeply flawed. He realized, in bitter hindsight, that he had projected his insecurities onto Eliza, punishing her for something he hadn't the courage to confront in himself. On a chilly afternoon, Lucas returned to the quiet, secluded park where he and Eliza had once dreamed of bringing their own children. He sat on the same bench where they'd talked about the life they wanted to build together, about the children they'd once thought they'd have. Now, all that remained was an empty ache, a poignant reminder of the life he had pushed away. There was no one to share it with, no one to pass his legacy on to, not in the way he'd imagined, and certainly not with the certainty he once held. In the quiet of that empty park, Lucas finally faced himself. He could see how his own pride, his insistence on having the perfect family, had cost him the one thing that had made him truly happy. For the first time in his life, he allowed himself to mourn, not only for the love he'd lost but for the man he could have been if he'd chosen differently. Sitting in that quiet park, Lucas felt the weight of his regrets settle in, not as a burden, but as a lesson, a truth he could no longer ignore. For years, he'd thought power and control could shield him from vulnerability, that wealth could fill the emptiness his choices had created. But now, stripped of the illusions he'd spent his life building, he saw a path forward, though it was far from the one he'd once imagined. He realized he couldn't change the past or undo the pain he'd caused Eliza. The love they'd shared, the life they might have built together, was beyond his reach. But Lucas knew he could choose to be a better man moving forward, one who lived with humility, who understood the value of connection over status and legacy. Perhaps his legacy would no longer be in the form of a family line but in how he chose to use his wealth, his influence, and his remaining time. With a newfound sense of purpose, Lucas started to reconnect with the world beyond himself, choosing to give back in ways he had once dismissed. He began dedicating his resources to causes that genuinely touched him, supporting single parents, funding family services, and donating to infertility research foundations. He knew he couldn't erase the mistakes he'd made, but he could create a future where others might find the support and understanding he had once failed to offer. He spent less time in his mansion, finding solace in the simple, quieter corners of the city. And over time, he found that there was a peace that came from being vulnerable, from allowing himself to be part of something bigger than his ambitions. The emptiness that had once plagued him began to soften, replaced by a sense of belonging to a community, of finding value in connection rather than blood. One evening, as he walked along the river, he spotted a father and son laughing together as they tossed a ball back and forth. He stopped for a moment, watching the scene with a wistful smile. For the first time, he allowed himself to simply feel the joy in the lives of others, no longer burdened by his past or haunted by what might have been. Though Lucas had once been a man who believed in having control over everything, he now understood that real strength came from accepting life's uncertainties. His journey had been costly, but in the end it had brought him to a place of peace, where he could finally accept himself, flaws and all. He was ready to move forward, no longer chasing after dreams built on pride, but embracing the life he still had left to live, one day at a time. As Lucas walked away from the river that evening, he reflected on the journey that had brought him here, a journey that had broken down everything he once believed about himself, only to rebuild him in ways he hadn't anticipated. He had once thought his legacy would be measured in wealth, status, and a family that could carry on his name. Now he understood that true legacy came from love, humility, and the courage to face one's own flaws. His life had been a series of choices, many of them misguided, all of them driven by an insistence on control and perfection. In his pride, he had assumed he knew what was best, even when it meant hurting those he loved. He had walked away from Eliza, unable to see past his own expectations, blind to the value of the love she had offered unconditionally. In trying to avoid vulnerability, he had created a world in which he was utterly isolated, surrounded by wealth but empty of meaning. The pain he'd experienced had ultimately shown him what truly mattered, though it came at a cost he would always carry. He now understood that strength didn't lie in dominance or control, but in humility, in the ability to accept life's imperfections and the courage to face his own failures. It was a lesson he hoped others would learn without needing to endure the loss that had taught him. Lucas's story serves as a powerful reminder of the dangers of pride and the assumptions we carry about others. His journey shows that true connection isn't found in the fulfillment of expectations or dreams, but in the acceptance of others, and ourselves, as we truly are. His regrets had become his teachers, transforming his life in ways that no amount of money or control ever could. As he moved forward, Lucas was no longer haunted by the life he had missed out on. Instead, he focused on the present, on the people he could help, and on living with compassion. He was a changed man, a man who had learned, painfully, to appreciate the quiet grace of forgiveness, acceptance, and love. He hoped that anyone who heard his story might reflect on their own lives and consider the relationships they held dear. For in the end, our greatest legacy isn't in what we leave behind materially, but in the kindness and understanding we give to others. As Lucas's journey came to a close, His story leaves a profound call to action for all who hear it. A call to look inward, to question the assumptions we hold, and to let go of pride in favor of understanding and compassion. His experiences remind us that every choice shapes not only our lives but the lives of those around us. In the end, his story is about more than wealth, more than legacy. It's about finding the courage to be vulnerable, to embrace life's uncertainties, and to prioritize love over ambition. For those who feel touched by Lucas's story, consider how it might resonate with your own life. Are there relationships that have been strained by assumptions, by pride, or by a refusal to be vulnerable? Take a moment to reflect. Is there someone you could reach out to, or a part of yourself you could open up to others? Sometimes, in our effort to avoid pain or disappointment, we miss out on the depth of connection that truly makes life meaningful. Let Lucas's story be a reminder to value the people we care about while they are still with us. Pride and ego can cloud our vision, leading us to see others through a lens of expectation rather than acceptance. Lucas's hard-earned lesson invites us to examine our lives, to seek understanding and forgiveness, and to approach our relationships with humility and gratitude. If his story moved you, share your thoughts with others. Have you experienced moments of regret? Times when assumptions created a rift between you and someone you cared about? Reflect on what Lucas's journey might inspire in you. Growth often begins with acknowledgement, and sometimes the most powerful transformations come when we allow ourselves to confront our own shortcomings. Thank you for following Lucas's story and witnessing the lessons he learned. If you believe this story has a message worth sharing, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment. Share your own experiences of reconciliation, of overcoming pride, or of rediscovering what truly matters. Your reflections might just inspire someone else to reach out, to listen, or to reconnect with the people they love. Life is too short to let pride stand in the way of connection. Let Lucas's journey encourage you to approach your relationships with openness and humility. Together we can learn to live more deeply, love more fully, and leave a legacy built not on perfection, but on compassion and understanding.